And the job that farmers do is really, really important, really critical to society. And, you wouldn't think that if you look at the constant negativity and the constant war on livestock farming that you see in national media.
Hello and welcome to AgriFocus, brought to you by Agriland. I'm Stella Meehan and I'm joined today by Eddie Punch, the General Secretary of the Irish Cattle and Sheep Farmers Association, the ICSA, to talk about the state of the suckler sector. Eddie, let's start off with discussing the sector in general. There were just over 46,000 suckler-only farms in the country and 833,000 suckler cows in the country at the end of December. That's the department's figures. But suckler numbers are in decline. And where do you think it's going? Where do you think it will bottom out?
Yeah, well, certainly it's true that suckler numbers are in decline. Some of that is linked to the ending of milk quotas. So some of the bigger farms switched over to milk or got into enterprises related to milk. On the other hand, we have to face the facts that there are profitability difficulties in the suckler sector. The reality is that a lot of suckler farmers have seen their value of their direct supports come down. But we also have to look at the bigger picture in terms of the price of beef. And this has been a huge challenge for the suckler sector because the profitability of people who buy their weanlings is hugely important. And of course, some suckler farmers finish their cattle as well. I think there are certainly problems in terms of the way we have looked at suckler beef for a long number of years. What's really important is a special marketing strategy for suckler beef. There has been 6 million allocated to a suckler brand strategy, but in our view, it's going too slow. Nonetheless, work is being done on it, but we'd like to see a lot of buy-in from the meat factories. And we're not convinced yet that there's enough buy-in from meat factories to really try and drive a premium market for a natural, grass-fed, but also a naturally reared animal. And there's a lot of talk, I suppose, about animal welfare in wider society now. And the suckler sector can deliver that, but we're not seeing enough ambition for that. I think also, you have to look at, the grade as well. U-grade cattle in Ireland do not get enough of a bonus when you consider their much higher yield of meat. There's much higher yield of meat, but there's a lot higher yield of the high value cuts as well. And when you compare, for example, top quality suckler type beef, it's more valuable in other European countries like Italy, like France, and that is a structural problem we have here. So I think we need as well to have a real vision for the suckler sector. For a long number of years now, since I suppose 2015, all of the focus has been on dairy expansion, and there's a logic to that. It's more profitable. There's a logic to it, but now there are a whole lot of question marks about other sustainability metrics as well. And suckler farming, is less intensive. That's good in some respects. It's also vitally important to the smaller scale farms and the broken up, farms where, farms are fragmented. Those kind of farms can't get into dairying and don't want to anyway. So it's really important for the point of view of the west of Ireland in particular, but a lot of regions in Ireland, that we have a vibrant suckler sector. And it's a really important part of our beef business.
And Eddie, you talked about a vibrant suckler sector there, even though, we initially mentioned that the suckler sector seems to be in somewhat of a decline, but very much suckler farmers are looking for an injection for it to be marketed as a premium brand to revitalise it, I suppose. And there was wide-scale opposition in the very beginning to the Food Vision group for sheep and beef. And a so-called exit scheme. That's what they're calling it for dairy. We'll call it a so-called exit scheme. And across the board, nobody wanted it for suckler farming. However, Minister for Agriculture, Charlie McConalogue, came out recently and he sort of inferred that there was a lot more desire for such a suckler exit scheme than really was being admitted. Would you say that's fair to say, or is that what you're getting from the ground up, Eddie?
Well, I suppose there's no doubt that there is a lot of negativity in the suckler sector. There's also an age profile issue, and no matter what you say, as people get older, suckler farming is not easy. So those are realities. But on the other hand, from our point of view, in ICSA, we want to see a vibrant suckler sector because, we don't want suckler farming to be seen as some sort of quick fix for climate change demands. That's not really a win-win solution. And when it comes to climate, we need win-win solutions because in the end of the day, there's a huge global demand for quality protein. The suckler herd is part of that. So we're not from an ICSA point of view, we want to look positive to the future.
And recently announced by the Agriculture Minister, Charlie McConalogue, was this new National Beef Welfare Scheme. So the idea behind it is that funding is there now to help farmers improve animal health and husbandry. So essentially, farmers will be encouraged to meal feed calves before and after weaning. So obviously that's a good thing. But another requirement to get the funds for the scheme is the requirement for IBR testing. So that's obviously the long name. Most people know IBR, but it's infectious bovine rhinotracheitis. So Eddie, this seems to be an element of the scheme that has not been particularly welcomed by some suckler farmers.
Yeah, I suppose, look, the backdrop to this is 28 million was announced in last year's budget. That's not enough. And I suppose the meal feeding is a welcome measure, and we in ICSA propose that. So we're happy with that. The money for it, we think it's calculated too low. The IBR is something the department wanted, and there is a lot of frustration there that the money will go to vets and laboratories.
I suppose that's what farmers are really saying the money will go on, as you said, to vets and laboratories. There's a requirement there for 20 animals. The requirement is for 20 or more to be tested, or if you have less than 20 in your herd, up to 20 will be tested. So, be it 14, be it 15. You'll get an allocation through the scheme of €300 per herd. So when you break it down about the cost of a call out from a vet, what the cost of the blood tests is, the lab then has to analyse those blood tests. Is it going to, I suppose, is any of that money going to go to the actual suckler farmer himself?
Yeah. And, we think it's wrong for the minister now to say it's 28 million for the suckler farmer. It's 28 million for the scheme. We can't get an exact analysis of how that breaks down yet because we don't know the profile of who goes into the scheme. But we would guess in ICSA, farmers will get about 21 million. And 7 million will go to vets and labs and so on. And that's, look at IBR is testing is good in theory. People shouldn't spend money on vaccinating if they don't need it. But on the other hand, we have to be honest and say this is not 28 million for farmers. And I suppose the reality is that, it goes back to the CAP reform in a couple of years ago, where our proposal in ICSA was 10% of the single farm payment as it was then. The Pillar 1 payment would be allocated as a coupled payment to the suckler and sheep sectors. And we provided the department at the time a fully costed proposal, which would actually deliver 300 per suckler cow and 35 per ewe through a combination of Pillar 2 schemes and coupling in Pillar 1. The reality is no other farm organisation backed us. None of the beef organisations or indeed the dairy organisations backed us. But that was and still remains the only honest and credible way to deliver 300 per suckler cow. So we are unfortunately where we are trying to, I suppose, find an extra few quid in the kitty. And the fact is that what we now have for suckler farmers is less than 200 per cow. Now, there's another problem with this scheme, and I was talking to a farmer at Tullamore on Sunday, and, he was really angry because he's 100 suckler cows. And the new scheme is capped at 40 cows. We in ICSA strenuously oppose that. We think it is limiting the ambition for people to be able to make a commercial go of suckler farming. Yes, we know that the vast majority of suckler farmers are less than 40, but we shouldn't just assume that nobody wants to have more than 40 suckler cows.
Because Was beef up to 100, Eddie?
Yes,
Yeah.
and the farmer I was talking to was getting, over €8,000 from beep. And in this scheme, he'll get 1,700. Probably a lot of that 300 will go to the vet, as we discussed. So he's gone from over 8,000 down to €1,400. And that's a real blow to someone who's trying to be commercial at suckler farming. And the dairy farm organisations were very annoyed recently at 120 of a limit for milking machine grants. But we've got ICSA is the only organisation that is complaining about a 40 head limit on the ambition for a suckler farmer.
And, you mentioned there, I suppose, about the 28 million overall budget, which works out more practically and realistically if you break it down to about 21 million for farmers. But if the minister was here, I suppose, just to play a bit of devil's advocate, he would argue that, this new beef welfare scheme in conjunction with SCEP, the suckler carbon efficiency, he argues himself that that's giving about €200 an animal at the moment between the two schemes. And he said he called for that when he was in opposition. He's now in government. So he said he would argue he is delivering for sucklers. You're saying that's not the case, and even 200 an animal is not enough. You'd be looking for 300 an animal.
Yeah, so if you really stretch it, there is 200 of a transfer, the first 22 cows. Because in the SCEP scheme, you get 150 on the first 22. After that, you're down to 120. And then the farmer who has more than 40 cows is getting 120 in the SCEP scheme, assuming she or he has a quota for it or a reference for it. So they're getting 120 from that, and they're getting 0 additional above 40 cows under the beef welfare scheme. So, €200, not really. In fact, you could say it's 185 on the first 22 cows, and after that, it's shrinking.
The budget is coming up and all farm organisations are putting in their speak, I suppose you call it, to try and get what they can, but specifically in relation to the suckler sector. Because as you know yourself, Eddie, come budget time, every crow is cawing and there's demands from every sector. And, who's to say who gets more, who gets less, or where the priority is. You said in the initial opening there that you think the sector really needs a rejuvenation. What sort of response are you getting from government ministers, from the department, civil servants? Are they looking at other sectors over suckler sector, or do you feel that this year there is an appetite there to try and help the suckler sector?
One of the problems is the 28 million from last year's budget is a 1-year commitment. So we have to make sure that, it's repeated for the years ahead. And that's a key thing we asked in our meeting on the pre-budget with Minister McConnell. The sheep sector is also hugely important. And for a while now, we've been fighting to ensure that there is a far more significant payment to the sheep sector as well. And let's not forget the beef sector either, the beef finishing sector, who, to a certain extent, a lot is being asked of them in terms of the climate targets, but there is no proposal there as of yet to support people to be more efficient. We propose that people would be paid to weigh cattle, above a year old, and that there would be an incentive for them to become more efficient so they could finish cattle earlier without feeding any extra meal. But the reality is that the beef finishing sector has got absolutely hammered by price cuts in recent weeks. It is absolutely shocking. And, there's a real sense of anger out there. Farmers are listening in the media to, constant negativity around climate change, constant negativity around water quality. Farmers are trying to, be more efficient all the time, be more sustainable all the time. But in the sectors we in ICSA represent, all you see is, how can you plan a business? How can you, try to invest to be more sustainable, either economically or ecologically, when you don't even know what price you're going to get for beef next month? And when you see people, who bought cattle in good faith at the start of the year, now facing weekly price cuts in beef, it is absolutely, in our view, disgraceful that look these are people trying to raise families. the pressure, and I hear this from our members now a lot at the moment, that people are under mentally, because of the financial difficulties that they're facing, because beef price can be cut just like that. It is no way to run a business. It is intolerable for farmers, who hoped maybe, a few months ago that, we could assume that beef price would be around €5, even though, there were figures showing by Chagas last year, winter finishing needed €6 a kilo. But at least facing into this, at springtime, they thought maybe 525, 550 would at least be there. And now here we are, talking about 465 and working its way down. It is no way to run a business. We in ICSA met Tesco a couple of weeks ago and said, we can't do any more of this. And they accepted that from their perspective, it was unsustainable that beef price had been frozen in terms of the consumer for the last 8 or 9 years, that there was no further scope to cut beef price in terms of what the consumer paid and in terms of what the farmer got. And yet here we are with beef prices being cut on a weekly level. It is really frustrating. And then on top of all of that, to have the constant negative narrative about, farmers need to do more, farmers need to do more. They need to survive and to look after their families first and foremost.
And Eddie, in terms of, you were speaking about beef price there and the image, I suppose, of farmers in general needing to be more environmentally friendly, to have more sustainable methods of production. But at the same time, we are also promoting and trying to promote through a PGI application in the European Commission, the Irish grass-fed beef image. So we are going to Europe and literally saying our beef is grass-fed. I mean, could you put more of an image of sustainability on one of our most premium export products than that?
No, you couldn't. And the reality is that farmers are in the business of nutrition. Protein is really important to people's health. There's a frustration that the PGI has taken so long. It's going on for 5 years now. There's a frustration that the suckler brand has taken so long. But we do have to get back to, farmers are in the business of producing healthy nutrition for consumers all over the world. Global demand for dairy, for meat, for beef and lamb in particular is only going upwards, even though there may be, the European market is up and down. Nonetheless, there is a real demand for these products. And if Irish farmers don't produce them, someone else will. And it makes no sense to us to hear calls to cut the national herd when the reality is that the demand for global, at a global level for quality protein, vitamin D, calcium, iron, really important elements that can't be easily got in any other diet, that's continuing to rise. And we should be proud of what we are doing in Ireland. And we should be ensuring that farmers, and there should be, a national unity, but there isn't, around making sure that farmers are economically viable and sustainable and continue to do this. And yes, of course, farmers want to be more sustainable from the environmental perspective as well. Lots of farmers, 45,000 farmers went into acres. It was not expected. Farmers want to be more sustainable, but they have to have the funding to do that as well. And I think, one of the things that really frustrates me is that in 1973, when we joined the EU, our national herd was 7.3 million, at June figures. And now it's at 7.4 million. So over the past 50 years, our herd has been remarkably stable. And from the global warming potential measurement, that is really the best you can do in terms of, having no additional impact of global warming. But in the same time, global population has almost doubled and they all have to be fed. And the job that farmers do is really, really important, really critical to society. And, you wouldn't think that if you look at the constant negativity and the constant war on livestock farming that you see in national media. And it's a real source of frustration to farmers. And I think, we're not far from a scenario where people will be crying out for people to go into farming because, lots of young people are going to get disheartened from this constant abuse they're getting from an element in public debate.
Yeah, actually, I just want to pick up on that point, Eddie. You said there, like young farmers coming in, like whatever about dairying. How can you see a potential future for farmers who want to take over the suckler farm from their father or mother in the support level that it has at the moment, the future viability of it? That's in suckler farm and the price of weanlings, obviously the greater beefer sector then in the terms of beef price and so on, and the measures that are coming in and the requirements of sustainability and environmental methodologies that are, conducive to being more sustainable in terms of your production. You're in the ICSA. You can tell me straight out, how many younger members are you getting in on a yearly basis coming into, I know you mentioned sheep earlier, but we'll focus on the sucklers. Like, how many young people nowadays are thinking that suckler farming is going to be a viable, sector for them in the future? I'm sure certainly a lot of them are definitely not thinking full time anyway.
Yeah. And I suppose there's, it's a little bit complex, right? Because there's a lot of young people who are really, really proud of the cattle they're producing. They're really into producing, real top quality weanlings. There's a kind
Absolutely.
of
And
a,
even more so in recent years. Yeah.
yeah, there's a kind of a Rowan's of Twitter vibe goes on, right? So it's not true to say that young people aren't interested in livestock farming, or they're not interested in cattle or sheep for that matter. And there's a real good vibe around people who are proud of, if you're at Tullamore Show, obviously you see lots of young people leading cattle around the show rings. So people are proud of what they do. But there is, of course, the economic realities as well. And so for some of those, what they want is to make a fair return, but on a part-time basis. But, if you've got an off-farm job, there's a limit to how much time you can put into farming, and you do want to get some sort of reward for the amount of time you put in there. On the other hand, there are still larger cattle and sheep farms where I think it's a reasonable ask that they would be viable on a full-time basis. But we've got to get that balance right. But no matter how much, you are part-time or full-time, every hour has to be profitable that you work on that farm. And I think that's a reasonable ask. It doesn't mean that you're going to make, a full-time living to raise a family off, 30 suckler cows, but at the same time, it should be profitable. And I think those are the kind of asks we should have. But in the end, and if anything, the war in Ukraine tells us food security can't be taken for granted. And what really baffles me about the climate change argument is that climate change means more drought, potentially in a lot of Europe or potentially in North America. And that means a challenge to food security, a huge challenge. And if you believe, as I think most farmers do, that climate change is a real problem, it makes no sense then to say that the probable worst impact of climate change, food security, is going to be solved by either forcing a cut in the national herd in Ireland or by allowing a situation to continue where people can't make a fair price for their product that they have lovingly put together over 3 years, be that suckler beef or lamb or whatever it is. We have to have reality here. Foods, like sensible policy, has food security, energy security, social concerns, rural, regional balance, and climate change all put together into one kind of win-win scenario. We need win-win solutions, not, negativity, and not cutting out food production that is so badly wanted. And we've got to get the economics of that right before we can actually talk. You can't be green if you're in the red. We have to have the economics right, and we have to have a sense of pride and confidence in what our farmers are doing. And as I say, it really frustrates me to hear, the urban commentariat, treating farmers like as if they're some sort of pariah in society. They are essential for the future of humanity. And we have to have a wake-up call here because, unfortunately, a lot of, political leaders right across the world seem to have lost sight of that fact.
Well, that's all we have time for in this episode of AgriFocus. Thank you to my guest, General Secretary of the ICSA, Eddie Punch, for coming in and talking all things suckler and indeed the wider beef sector. And we touched on sheep there as well. It'll be very interesting going forward to see what does come out of budget 2024, Eddie, and no doubt you will be back to us in advance of that and subsequently after to let us know your thoughts and opinions on the support for the beef sector in this country. Thank you for listening. Please rate and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. That's all for now. We'll be back shortly again with another episode of AgriFocus.